One of the most well-known gods of ancient Egypt was Anubis. He was the god whose duty it was to guide the souls of the dead into the afterlife. This is one of the reasons why he's shown with the head of a jackal or a human with a jackal's ears. Jackals were scavengers that would eat the corpses of the dead, so they were associated with death. However, as time went on, Anubis took on more duties and became more than just the god of the dead. And while he may not have been the supreme ruler of the Egyptian pantheon, he was certainly a major player in many myths and legends. So who exactly was Anubis? What was his role in ancient Egyptian society, and how did his iconography evolve over time? Unfortunately, we don't know too much about Anubis' origins, but it's believed that he was around from the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. In fact, some scholars think that Anubis may have been one of the first gods to be worshipped by the Egyptians. One of the earliest known depictions of Anubis is from around 3500 BCE and shows him as a man with the head of a jackal. Over time, his appearance changed and he was shown with either a human or a jackal head. In later times, Anubis was often depicted as a man wearing a distinctive outfit. He would wear a leopard skin around his waist, and his ears would be adorned with jewelry. His staff looked like an upside-down question mark, and he also wore a crook and a flail, which were tools used for herding and capturing animals. Another item that he was often shown with was the heart of the dead person during the ceremony of the weighing of the heart. The heart was placed on one side of a scale, and Anubis would then place a feather representing truth on the other side. If the heart was found to be pure, then the deceased was allowed to move on to the next stage of their journey. However, if the heart was impure, then it was eaten by a goddess called Amit, who was depicted as a crocodile with a lion's forebody and a human lower body. So what was the significance of the different depictions of Anubis? Why was he sometimes shown as a man and other times as a jackal? Well, there are a few possible explanations. One is that the Egyptians believed that Anubis could shapeshift, taking on either form at will. Another possibility is that the different depictions represent different aspects of his personality or powers. For example, the human-headed Anubis may have been seen as more intellectual and wise, while the jackal-headed version was seen as more wild and instinctual. It's also possible that the choice of which form to depict Anubis in depended on the artist's personal preference or the specific context of the artwork. There is no clear evidence to say which explanation is correct, so it's likely that all of these factors played a role. Anubis was not only a god of death, but he was also associated with mummification and the journey of the soul through the underworld. The Egyptians believed that after a person died, their soul would travel to the underworld, where it would have to pass through a number of obstacles in order to reach the field of reeds, which was the Egyptian version of heaven. Along the way, the soul would have to battle with demons, solve riddles posed by gods, and convince the gods to let them pass. And of course, there was the famous scene of the weighing of the heart, which we talked about earlier. If the soul made it through all of these tests, then they were considered pure and worthy of entering the field of reeds. But if they failed even one part of the journey, then they would be sent to a place called the House of Darkness, which was basically hell. As you can see, the Egyptians had a pretty complicated view of the afterlife. They didn't believe that when you died, you either went to heaven or hell. Instead, your fate depended on your actions during your life and whether or not you were able to make it through the challenges that awaited you in the underworld. And since Anubis was the god who guided the souls through the underworld, it's easy to see why he was so important to the ancient Egyptians. They needed to know that there was at least someone on their side helping them to get through this scary and dangerous journey. Anubis wasn't just a helpful guide. He was also a protector of the dead. The ancient Egyptians believed that Anubis would keep evil spirits away from the body after death and help to preserve it during the mummification process. Mummification was a very important part of Egyptian culture, and they would go to great lengths to ensure that the body of their loved ones was preserved as well as possible. Part of this was because they believed that the soul would return to the body eventually, and they wanted to make sure that it would be able to recognize its physical form. But it was also a way to show respect for the deceased and to honor their memory. The Egyptians believed that Anubis helped the embalmers by giving them the knowledge and skills necessary to perform the rituals correctly. If the mummification process was not done properly, then the soul would not be able to move on to the afterlife and would be doomed to wander the earth as a ghost. So you can see how important Anubis was in ensuring that everything went smoothly. Another important aspect of Anubis's role was his ability to protect the dead on their journey through the underworld. As we mentioned earlier, the underworld was a dangerous place, and there were many obstacles that the dead had to overcome. Anubis would guide the soul past the obstacles and help them to avoid any potential dangers. He was also there to offer comfort and support to the dead, especially when they were facing their final tests. The Egyptians believed that Anubis gave the dead the strength they needed to pass the trials, and that he was there to greet them when they arrived in the field of reeds. Even though Anubis had many important duties, he was never seen as the supreme ruler of the Egyptian pantheon. That title belonged to a god named Ra, who was the sun god. Ra was the most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon, and he was worshipped as the creator and sustainer of the universe. Other gods such as Osiris, Horus, and Anubis were seen as subordinates to Ra, and they each had their own specific roles to play in keeping the universe in balance. Anubis's main responsibility was to guide the dead through the underworld. But he wasn't the only god involved in this process. There were many other deities that the Egyptians believed assisted Anubis in carrying out his duties. One of the most important of these was a goddess named Isis, who was the wife of Osiris and the mother of Horus. Isis was the goddess of magic, and she was responsible for helping the dead person's soul to maintain its human form as it traveled through the underworld. She would also offer protection to the soul and help it to avoid any evil spirits that might try to harm it. Another god that worked with Anubis was Wepwawet, who was depicted as a small dog or a jackal. Wepwawet was the god of the sunrise, and he was associated with the first hours of the day when the sun would begin its journey across the sky. He was seen as a helper god, and he assisted Anubis by lighting the way for the dead person's soul as it traveled through the underworld. Wepwawet's presence was especially important at the beginning of the journey when the soul had to cross the river Styx. Without his help, the soul would have been lost and would not have been able to reach the field of reeds. Finally, there was a god named Duamutef, who was the god of the hour between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. Duamutef was depicted as a baboon with a human head, and he was responsible for guarding the entrance to the underworld. He made sure that only those who were meant to enter were allowed to do so, and he also prevented any evil spirits from getting inside. Duamutef was a fierce protector, and he would not hesitate to use violence to defend the entrance to the underworld. As you can see, Anubis was just one part of a larger system that the Egyptians believed oversaw the process of death and the afterlife. While he was an important figure in this system, he wasn't the only one, and he relied on the help of other gods to carry out his duties. And that's all we have for you today. We hope you enjoyed learning about Anubis, the god of death in ancient Egypt. If you want to learn more about ancient Egypt, stay tuned for more videos. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.